Anyway, let's take it from the top one more time, and then when we get to the end, we'll have kind of our discussion time. Basically, guys, Nemo, Tokido, Gachiku, Momochi, and Kawano, they come together to form the first Senshukai, the Players Association. There are a group of players that are made to gather opinions of players and formally, officially, as a body, convey them to Jesu and Capcom, Street Fighter League organizers, etc. A big focus of a lot of this article was Street Fighter League, because I think it's just it's very important to the Street Fighter ecosystem here in Japan. You got to understand it's a really big deal, and we'll get into reasons why shortly. But Nemo starts off by saying, look, you can't mention specifics, but they've already been able to have discussions and give feedback on Street Fighter League improvement points that players would like for next year. When asked if there has ever been feedback or discussion with them before, and this is Jesu, of course, he said basically no. And Momochi kind of added that in the past there have been some private conversations here and there, but maybe some of those problem points weren't properly addressed or they went unheard. So basically doing things like this feels a lot better. One thing that Nemo brings up specifically is the schedule. This is something that I thought even way back when Street Fighter League was first kind of doing its thing. But the schedule for, if you guys don't know, Street Fighter League in Japan compared to the Street Fighter League Europe, compared to Street Fighter League North America, the schedule is pretty active, pretty rigorous. It's really rough, man. Especially if, you know, from what I remember in 2019, especially there were weeks where you would have Street Fighter League throughout the week. Then you'd have a CPT event that weekend that maybe they give you like a day cushion on, but then you'd have to come back and get right back in the studio for Street Fighter League again. And it's like, man, these players are machines, dude. Like, just commit when you have to commit, like, you know, 7 days straight of play, travel, play, travel, play, and all of it has to be at a high level or you're just not going to maintain your status. That can be really rough. And, you know, just like for comparison's sake, last year's Street Fighter League schedule in Japan, the 2022 season started in September, ran all the way up until December. Then you have the playoffs at the end of December. In January, they had their grand finals. In February, right now, you have the World Championships alongside the Capcom Pro Tour season final. And in the meantime, during all that, you also had CPT online events and other events as well. They also have caravan events. I don't think they do these overseas, but basically caravan events are kind of like fan meet and greet events. So last year they went to Kumamoto, which is down south in Japan, and you had like pro player improvement courses. They gave like talks and discussions on how to improve in the game, how to play better. But you really get a sense for, man, this is a this is a schedule, bruh. Managing that schedule for players who are not just Street Fighter players. What if, you know, their fighting game career is a side thing? What if they have a main job doing something else? The intersection between those schedules has been something that has consistently been a pain point for players in the league here. Tokido says that even amongst players that are at the top that are eating, there are a lot of problems to address. And it isn't just about doing right by the 5 players here, but it's about doing right by all the players who are investing in playing these games and competing like this. Momochi kind of continues that he says players who don't necessarily have the distinction of being pros, but have normal jobs, working hours, they have a lot of difficulty working with the league in terms of scheduling, and these players don't usually have strong means of being able to voice their opinions and discuss issues with organizers and publishers. In this case, of course, being Capcom. Momochi wants the Players Association to be able to represent these players and bring their concerns to Jesu and Capcom on behalf of the players. You know, it's a really long article. It's just like a back and forth conversation the whole time. A line that Nemo and Tokido really use pretty often in this interview is they want to be able to move forward without regret. They want to create an environment where everyone can be able to do their best and improve the conditions, not necessarily like solve every, you know, like voila, we did it guys, we solved everything, but basically just work to improve conditions without regret, so that players can compete and play and do this stuff and not feel like they're boxed in or like they made some mistakes along the way. That's really a point that they hammer in throughout the article. They then move on to talk about, Momochi brings up that if there are problems that they want to be able to act on and resolve issues with, they will. But ideally, there are never these issues that they have to make moves on to begin with. It's not like they're looking for trouble. Even the question I think comes up at some point in the article where it's like, do you guys think like ill of like some of these groups that you're working with, like with Jessu and Capcom? And it's like, no, it's not that. It's just the player side hasn't really been represented in a lot of this. The player perspective and the player concerns is a side of all this that hasn't really been addressed and respected up until now. So the next part of the article talked about the difficult balance between publishers, media, and players. Street Fighter League has to use the company IP, and it uses players and their fan followings to develop an entertainment media product. Without the players, it's meaningless. You know, who's it for then? What audience are you bringing to this? Momochi, again, he emphasized that key point that I was talking about earlier. He wants to create an environment where players can partake in this, participate in it, and they can compete in it without a sense of regret. Momochi believes players have low value to publishers because if there are terms or conditions that a player cannot abide by, or that they don't agree with, or they refuse something, the publisher can just move on to the next player. You're a dime a dozen as a player. Even with regards to players at the top percent, you got to think like, is every player looked at the same by every group involved in our events and our turn? Like, do you think that? I don't think so. And that's kind of what he's alluding to. Esports is fundamentally, from their perspective, right, what that word means is it's publishers working together with media companies working together with players. So it's weird that in Japan you have Jessu, you have your publishers, you have companies like Jessu. Basically the issue is that the players side has not been represented in a lot of these discussions and in a lot of these decisions up until now. And this group is one that is conscious of that, and they want to work to correct that. The ecosystem, and really what that means in Japan. And it's, you know, talking about Street Fighter and fighting games in Japan, you guys have to understand, in Japan, in this generation, Street Fighter and Smash are by far, I think by a large margin, the two games that have the biggest push. And by biggest push, I mean not just in terms of like content and appeal, but also the ability to attract an audience and also to attract younger players. That's a point where a lot of other fighting games have really had a tough time keeping up, in Japan specifically. If you guys watch like Toph's videos where he talks with Amsa and talks about Smash Brothers in Japan, you might get a sense for how difficult it is to work as a Smash player here. Even in spite of how popular and how strong the IP is. That leaves us with Street Fighter, which you guys have to understand. Street Fighter is not just their world tour. In Japan, they have the CPT events. They have Street Fighter League. There's just more content and more avenues to be able to play and make a name for yourself and make it a thing out here. There's way more just volume to it compared to some other titles. And so Nemo states like he doesn't want to just move to another game. In this case, in this context, what he's talking about is like MOBAs or FPS. You can't just like, okay, I'm playing fighting games, but this stuff isn't working out. Let me just go play a shooting game. It doesn't work that way, right? He wants to improve conditions of the Street Fighter ecosystem in Japan, and he wants to use this Players Association to publicly address specific points and improve it. Toyota, if you guys don't know, that's Nyanshi. He's the guy that runs Topanga. He was also sitting in on this conversation. So there's roughly like 8 people in this room, and they're all just kind of like talking. And that's the article is just a transcription of that combo. Toyota thinks that there isn't really a path from his point of view for pro players when they're finished playing. That's something that's interesting food for thought. They can work for media companies or publishers, but that's really about it from his point of view. So obviously content creation, streaming, I would say that's part of media as well. I don't think he's ignorant to that, but it's interesting food for thought. You know, think about some of your favorite players. For here in Japan, a lot of those old guys, it's like, man, they're kind of getting up there when it hits a point where they're not able to consistently perform at the highest level like that. Like, what are some of these guys gonna do? I bounced that over to the West too. What do you guys think, like, for some of these players who you're looking at in the West, and when maybe they're not able to still have the same relevance or performance level, let's say, in the new game that maybe they did in this game? Where are some of those players going to go? Like, what are they going to do? What have they been doing? Where have they been going? Nemo thinks it's bad that for younger players, they're just watching all this stuff and all they see is, damn, all I have to do to hit it in Japan is win a tournament and I get a pro license, then I'm going to make the money. When that's not necessarily the case. It isn't. It's definitely not for some games. fighting games specifically, but even in Street Fighter, where there are more opportunities by comparison, it's still not necessarily the case. And he wants that uncomfortable reality of the ecosystem to be more widely recognized. 4Gamer in particular brings up that exploitation exists in all industries to some degree, most industries to some degree, but in esports in Japan, it certainly does exist. And Momochi kind of expands on this, saying that for a while there have been issues going on where players are kind of competing and going along with some stuff just to be able to hit that next level or be able to maintain a certain image or status, even if there are kind of like nuances or stuff on the back end that come with not playing ball like that. So he brings up the example. He's like, okay, so you're a pro in Japan, right? Let's say you're a pro Street Fighter player. If you can't qualify for Capcom Cup, what do you think that does to your value as a professional? It's lowered, obviously. So what does this mean? The effect is that it's going to lead to people competing out of desperation, basically, even if sometimes the conditions aren't very good, or if this is sloppily put together, or this schedule is insane, stuff like that. You're just going to compete, and you're just going to do it because it's what you have to do, or there's that sensation of, I have to do this. They then post a hypothetical at some point where they say, like, what if Capcom just tomorrow was like, no more CPT, no more SFL? What does that do for some of the players here, or like the ecosystem? Where does that leave things? That's a very extreme, they say this in the article, that's a very extreme hypothetical. They want to work as a players association and be able to represent players' opinions and concerns, to where these hypotheticals they're not even a thing. They just want to be able to consistently improve the ecosystem conditions. That brings us to the end of it, basically, where they kind of just put it on the players who were there for closing comments. And Kawano is the last one to speak. What he says is he's the youngest player out of this kind of committee, so he wants to be a point where other young players who maybe might feel intimidated to approach some of the older players, if they want to get advice or if they want to talk to him, they can go to him. Gachikun talked about how much he likes baseball and how he wants the league here to be a league like that, where everybody who plays can eat, reliably. And Nemo notes that there are a lot of players on dog shit contracts. It was a conversation point that came up for a little while, but they can ask him for advice if they want to know more, or if they need consultation. And Momochi said this as well. He said he wants to create an industry where people can aspire to be professionals, and that they can attract a new generation of young players that are not being taken advantage of. It highlights a few things. The first to me is, when I think about how I'm doing the stream, we're talking about this news article breaks in the middle of an 8-day long Capcom Cup. And the question in the back of my mind is, who is this for? I think it highlights something that I kind of felt for a while, me personally. It's that the conditions and management of a lot of these like FGC sports projects sometimes can be done by people who are from another group, or have never entered a tournament, or they're not really concerned with the community or player experience like that at all. They can't understand it. Looking at the way the TWT final was 2 back-to-back 17-hour days, you got Knee on Twitter crying about these like, I'm hungry on Twitter. It's kind of crazy to read something like that. Like, why did someone think that this was okay? You got people showing up to play in the LCQ. Now they got to take 10 days off of work to be able to play in it. Like, who is this for? In my opinion, in my experience, players can sometimes be the biggest bitches on planet Earth, but their experience is also very important, and your experience as a player too. I think it should help you with a lot of this kind of stuff from a planning perspective, but I feel like it ends up not. Sometimes the way some of this stuff is arranged, and it's not like I'm going in on anybody either. You got to understand, man. It's like, for some of these people who it's their job to organize some of these events, they are put in situations where maybe they're very handcuffed by like budget restrictions, or they have to hit a certain margin of KPI or viewership, or whatever. You and I don't know, right? That's something that them and their bosses figure out. In spite of that, you still have to keep the players in mind, because without them, this shit doesn't really make sense. It doesn't move. It's something that I've kind of felt in the back of my mind for a while now, watching some of these official events and stuff like this. But it's like, man, I just have to ask the questions, like, in the beginning of the article, when they're like, they were talking about Street Fighter League and feedback with Jesu, the 4Gamer guy asked, he's like, have they not had this conversation before with you guys? And like, not really. And I'm just like, that's so batshit insane. I'm just thinking, like, if you're making a product that is going to heavily involve one group of people, wouldn't you try to have their opinion? Wouldn't you try to see their perspective? That's just crazy to me in a kind of like saddish way. And it just reminds me of something that I have felt personally for a while. And it's just to put it in plain French, man. Sometimes I really feel like we know hype better than the people that are supposed to be making the hype, and it's really frustrating. The other thing that this highlights to me is, and I touched on it earlier, is the dissonance between that Street Fighter Smash crust and other games in Japan, other fighting games, right? Things like IP strength, I think volume of opportunities, and what that means for these players with the highest levels of influence. You know, like a lot of these players that are, I mean, shit, some of the players in this group even, these were players that used to play a lot of different games, you know, a lot of different fighting games, but they don't anymore. And, you know, it's mostly also because of the shift that happened with Street Fighter, late Street Fighter 4, I would say, Street Fighter 5. I think JP players kind of got together and they said, if we want this shit to work, it's got to be through Street Fighter, nothing else. We're not even going to bother with the other stuff. And, you know, for better or worse, you know, it's different when for some of these guys, things have become about a job or supporting the family that they have. You got to understand that becomes a very different responsibility, a very different discussion. It highlights a dissonance in terms of the volume of support, appeal, and opportunities between fighting games in Japan. The fact that this whole group is all players who are into Street Fighter, it only really exists because compared to the other games, Street Fighter League poses so many issues and points of contention and potential problem points where players and publishers and event organizers might have differences. It kind of highlights, man, there are really just not that many opportunities to really push it if you are into some of these other fighting games that aren't Street Fighter in Japan. And it makes it really easily perceivable why you have so many, I'd say, like highly influential players trying to push themselves through this game. It makes sense if you look at it and you listen to like what they're saying here. And you know, that's kind of unfortunate. That's kind of sad because I think especially looking towards the West with some of these other games, it really feels like the Western communities are the ones that are pushing them. In the case of this discussion where you have like these JP players who are talking about domestic issues that are here in Japan with regards to their own little micro separate cinematic universe, you know, Japan is a very like niche community in a way. It's not that there aren't people who complain either, but what I'm saying is you look at this where there are consistently issues that they have realized and noticed, and in order to solve them, they got together, they said, you know what, we're going to make a committee, we're going to make a website where if you are a license holder and you have had issues, you can talk to us about your issues and we'll put it on the table with Jesu and Capcom. I think on some level that's really cool. And I'm not saying that players in the West should do the exact same thing. I don't think that it's necessary. It's more about when there is a problem, I want you to think about what do we do to solve it? How do we act? If there's some crazy stuff going on, I don't think like commentators should be doing PR on behalf of like the event on Twitter. That's always really weird. Seeing how they kind of problem solve, or like they're at least like trying to do something different to be able to have these conversations and resolve some issues. Comparing that to our tried and true, which is literally just like raise hell on Twitter. It kind of I don't know. It makes me think like a little bit more deeply about how we go about discussing and talking about serious issues that we have with competition or events or formatting or the way something's done or presented, you know, that kind of thing. If the be all end all is just get on Twitter and just like, you know, shit post and type in all caps, like, you know, if that's the be all end all, what I want you to think about is like, is that really constructive? Is that really the best way? It's just it's food for thought, just about how we go about solving issues within our own kind of community space. It's just something that I want people to think a little bit more about. But anyway, sorry about this. This is drawn out, really big deal. It kind of got swept under the rug in the midst of the Capcom Cup and all this stuff. But this is new news out here, and There's been a good bit of discourse about it, both good and bad, out here in Japan. But I wanted to at least present it to you guys and kind of, you know, follow through with previous stuff that I've done talking about this kind of stuff. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll holler at you guys next time.